I will start with introducing the keynote speaker. Bertram Luda is a professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he directs the Center of Informatics Research in Science and Scholarship. He is also a faculty affiliate with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications and the Department of Computer Science at U of I. Until 2014, he was a professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of California, Davis, and a faculty member of the UC Davis Genome Center. His research interests range from practical questions in scientific data and workflow management to database theory and knowledge representation and reasoning. Prior to his faculty appointments, he was a research scientist at the UCSD Supercomputer Center and an adjunct faculty at the CSE department at UC San Diego. He received his MS degree in computer science from the University of Karlsruhe and his PhD from the University of Freiburg in Germany. The presentation title for his talk today is about computational reproducibility versus transparency. Is it fair enough? So the reproducibility crisis has resulted in much interest in the methods and tools to improve the computational reproducibility. Fair data principles are also being adapted and evolved to apply to other artifacts, notably computational analysis as well. So the current focus on the computational reproducibility of scripts and other computational workflows sometimes overshadows somewhat neglected and arguably more important issue, the transparency of data analysis, including data wrangling and cleaning. In this talk, Bertram will ask the question, what information is gained by conducting a reproducibility experiment? This leads to a simple model that aims to answer this question by sorting out different scenarios. Using data cleaning recipes from OpenRefine as an example, he will present some approaches to improve the transparency and reproducibility of such recipes through the workflow analysis. Finally, he will present some features of the Hotel project, which is a computational platform for reproduce and transparent computational experiments. So Bertram, you may start over. Thank you.
For the introduction, and also to all the organizers, Anna and Jin, both of whom I've had the pleasure of working with before, and to give you a quick overview of a couple of things. I fear I have a broad set of things that I'd like to talk about. I want to give special thanks and also apologies to Tim McPhillips, from whom I borrowed a lot of slides from a joint presentation at the workshop on research objects that was held in San Diego in 2019 at the eScience conference. And there's also ideas that were developed jointly in a reproducibility of data-oriented experiments in eScience Dachstuhl seminar that's in Germany, that was in 2016. And I'm happy to provide pointers to both, maybe through a chat or in our social event later, or you can Google them, of course. All right. So first things first, a brief overview. So I want to sort of briefly relate the very interesting notions and policies around FAIR, and then seeing how they apply to what's really the focus of this talk, is reproducibility. We've heard all the notion of a reproducibility crisis, and maybe somewhat related, there's this idea that maybe we gotta just get our terminology straight, because there is a sort of a terminology crisis as well, as I see it. And then later, I'd like to sort of shift attention a little bit from the terminology issues to really the question, cui bono, I think it would be in Italian, although my Italian is really bad. So who's gaining from this, and what are we gaining from a reproducibility study? Overall, I think the bottom line, if you have to leave right now, like this moment, I would say we should overall as a community try and shift a little bit our attention from the R words, from reproducibility replicability, repeatability, re-executability. Those are wonderful words and they're all very important. But for our scientific applications, we might also want to, focus attention on keywords, and transparency is the most important of them. They're of course all related, but they're not all the same. So I'll say something about that later in the talk. And I think a critical component to support transparency is this sort of technical notion of provenance information, data lineage, and so on. And I'll give a little bit of a very short introduction how in the Wholetail project, which is a large NSF collaboration, we're trying to address these issues, the needs for reproducibility and transparency. Okay, so we all are familiar, I think, with the FAIR data principles, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It seems to this community probably a given and not really surprising that metadata is key to all of that. So having good quality metadata can help with finding data, making it interoperable and reusable. It's not the only thing that's needed, but it's certainly a very important item. But we also notice that nowadays in the day and age of computational sciences, and then a lot of scientists really use computational methods to analyze data, to simulate nature, and so on. It seems like these FAIR data principles need to be extended and evolved to also apply to software, to code, and to maybe whole scientific workflows. And one of the, I think, ingredients also that's behind the ideas of FAIR is to somehow deal with the reproducibility crisis that we've all heard about, all the way from p-value hacking and harking and sloppy practices and all of those things. But again, a lot of times we seem to focus, and maybe rightfully so, on computational reproducibility. But that's where I want to sort of go in a little deeper and see what's happening in that space. So reproducibility is talked about a lot. And again, here my first apologies to Tim. I stole the slide and his tweet on that. The cartoon here says, reproducible, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And this is, of course, from, I think, another, The Princess Bride, I think, and there the word is, of course, not reproducible, but it's inconceivable. So the person seems to be talking about inconceivable all the time, while, obviously conceiving of those ideas. Okay, so what is the reproducibility crisis? What's behind that? Well, maybe let's start with a pop quiz, and you can use the chat to, poll to answer this question. I'd like to ask you, those of you in particular who are maybe in the sciences, but everybody really, what do you think is the single most effective way? So you've got to pick one, can't say all of the above. Single most effective way to make sure that your research is reproducible or more reproducible. So the options here are: employ interoperability standards for scientific data, metadata, software, and research objects, which is a new and important thing. Carefully record and report your work. Use open source software and make any new or modified code freely available. Apply the FAIR principles. Do your work using software containers. And then lastly, focus your research on intrinsically reproducible phenomena. Anybody wants to dare, put out their head, their neck, and say, okay, I vote for this, or I think it's A, B, C, D, E, or F. I didn't want to make it too easy and say all of the above. So think about when you're in the sciences in particular, maybe even in the natural sciences, to give you a hint. And if you had to pick one, what would you pick? Okay, so if somebody was brave and put a letter out there, and I find that very convincing, B. But all the other things are convincing too. I see some A's, I see an F. I mean, that's not a great, that's just an option F. Great. Okay, so I see there are different options out there. I think all of these things are important. There's no question that all of these things are important. Now, what the natural scientists have in their favor, maybe in contrast to, say, social scientists, is that they're working with and trying to uncover the workings of nature. So in the natural sciences, we're discovering things that are there, and whether we go and look for them or not. And we're discovering things that are conceivably, they could be different than they happen to be. Again, we have to look to find out. And it shouldn't matter who's doing the looking. And that gives the natural scientists, in principle, a certain advantage. The phenomena being studied are intrinsically reproducible. That's maybe also a reason why, although natural scientists, of course, are focusing a lot on reproducibility, they don't bother necessarily to re-execute somebody else's code. If you want to uncover how nature works, you can always go back and do another experiment. And all of these things should, in the end, fit together. So one way of looking at this then is nature, at least for those scientists, is the ultimate reproducibility arbiter. And that's why, answer F was maybe the one given typically by natural scientists, that if it can't be reproduced, it's probably not science, okay? But of course, we're also talking about other things, other domains, and then other challenges with computational reproducibility. So we'll look into these now. But as we look at the range and spectrum of sciences, we could maybe see a hierarchy, so this has to be taken with a grain of salt, but you could say that things like maths and physics are inherently maybe a little bit more reproducible. Not that there's nothing, no problems there, but as things get higher in this sort of hierarchy, things get more messy. I think this is clear, and we have more emergent laws of nature, and dealing with, say, human sciences and social sciences, often it's really hard because what we're studying might not be independent of who's doing the looking. Okay, so things get rather tough up there. So, of course, the natural sciences themselves also have immense problems with reproducibility. Nature is actually not quite deterministic. I mean, in fact, quite the opposite. There's chaos at all levels, there's randomness, but natural laws, math and logic serve as constraints of what's happening. We can understand these things by using, in particular, for example, math and logic and natural laws to probe nature. Good experiments are hard to design and to perform even once. So it's not easy at all for natural scientists. Instruments can be costly and limited in supply, so we can't just go back and say, oh, let's run this experiment again. Oh, it's just need another $5 million for the expedition. Not an option. Oh, wait 800 years. We recently had a nice constellation conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. If you want to observe that again, well, we've got to wait 800 years. And some of you will probably know the solar eclipse that was observed back in the day to check Einstein's theory on relativity and the bending of light. That was an effort. You had to go there on this particular place, hope that you can make an observation, and then good luck making that observation again in many years later. So obviously, we cannot all just rerun experiment that easily. But there's something that we can all do in science, and I think that we need to do, I argue that we have to do that, and that's being transparent. Okay, so no transparency, no science, I think you could say. Now let's look a little bit at what this organization, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, says about transparency. So FASEP, they define transparency as follows: the reporting of experimental materials and methods in a manner that provides enough information for others to independently assess and or reproduce experimental findings. So notice the and or reproduce. So we may or may not want to reproduce it. Maybe we can't, maybe it's too time consuming. And again, if you're in the natural sciences, we can always go back and devise another experiment. So in some sense, who knows what this other group has done? Do we really have to reproduce that? We can always look ourselves because nature still behaves, supposedly, the same way as it did when these guys were doing the experiments. So just trying to shift a little bit the attention or point out that there's something out there that we could also do beyond computational reproducibility. So transparency is what allows an experiment to be reviewed and assessed independently by others. Without transparency, I couldn't do that. It facilitates, of course, reproduction of results, but it does not require it. And in fact, in the sciences, in the natural sciences, it's normally considered a problem if exact repetition of the steps in reported research is required, either to evaluate the work or to reproduce results. So if we, quote unquote, slavishly have to follow the protocol to get the same result, the same finding, maybe we are not studying a very robust phenomenon that's inherently reproducible. And that's, of course, what the natural sciences try to study. We could also quantify repeatability. So experiments in the natural sciences are, of course, not exactly repeatable. Many things vary all the time, the materials, the conditions, the equipment. So it's sort of par for the course. It's understood that there's uncertainty that's associated with measurements. So for example, biologists, they have to perform replicate experiments to assess end-to-end repeatability. So they want to check first by replication, trying to do their own experiment over and over to see whether they get the same results if they keep everything fixed. So there's two technical notions that this community uses: technical replicates, measurements and data analysis performed on the same sample using the same equipment, and then biological replicates, measurements and data analysis performed on different but biologically equivalent samples on the same equipment. So the important thing in terms of the terminology here is we have this terminology of replicates that's being used in this domain of the biological sciences. So they know whether what they're studying even makes sense in the first place. Well, I can replicate it myself, and then I can, of course, conduct all the experiments and write it up and document it and share it, all of that. All right, now a little side note. Of course, the reason why biologists use the terminology is that on a day-to-day basis, they use these words all the time. So if they study biological processes, they will study replication and reproduction, and these things mean something. So the idea is that replication is the process that is where there's a lot of fidelity between sort of repetitions. So as we know, DNA is replicated within cells, and the replication mechanism is even error detecting to make sure things are exact copies to the extent possible as they were. On the other hand, again, in biology, we speak of reproduction, and in reproduction, we all know that's not without variation. In fact, it's a good thing. That's how evolution works. Variation in reproduction is desirable. So in terms of the terminology, where there's sometimes some confusion in this community anyways, and it's a large community, scientists use the terms replication and reproduction all the time, and they mean something, where replication is sort of the more faithful version of the process, and reproduction is the one where there's more variation, we're wiggling a little bit more. Similarly, you could also look what philosophers are saying. So here's an entry from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that talks about replication and reproduction. And again, you can check what this community is saying. And again, you see there's a high fidelity notion associated with the word replication. All right, now let's wrap this up and have a look at what this organization, which represents 30 scientific societies and 130 researchers, ballpark, what they mean by these words. So we earlier looked at what they mean by transparency, which is clearly central to all scientific endeavors. And then here, the notion of replicability and reproducibility. So replicability is the ability to duplicate, that is, repeat a prior result using the same source materials and methodologies. This term should only be used when referring to repeating the results of a specific experiment rather than an entire study. Reproducibility, on the other hand, is the ability to achieve similar or nearly identical results using comparable materials and methodologies. This term may be used when specific findings from a study are obtained by an independent group of researchers. So the bottom line is the way this community uses the terminology is such that replicability is maximal fidelity to the original experiment, whereas reproducibility is sort of less fidelity, and that's fine. That's in a way maybe desired, but these are different notions and they are used on a regular basis. Now, I think I should probably skip over this detail here about exact repeatability. We are, when we use computers, in the lucky situation that we can have a new notion here. That's not replication in the sense we've just seen, and not reproduction in the sense we've just seen, it's exact repeatability. So we have, because we're using computers, digital information, there are cases and opportunities where we can achieve exact repeatability. Now let's look what the ACM Computing Society, Association for Computing Machinery, the ACM, is doing in that space. So this is a snapshot of a terminology that they've been using for a while. Sorry, it's a little small, but I'll mention here 2 points that I want to highlight. Reproducibility, and the summary is different team, different setup, and replicability, different team, same setup. Now, if you go to the page today, and again, let's focus our attention on reproducibility and replicability, you see different team, same setup, and different team, different setup for replicability. So if we flip back and forth, we see different, different, same, and here we see different, same, different. So something is different. Okay, so now you can figure out what has happened here. Well, again, the notion of replicability, it used to be different team, same setup. So replication was the more faithful process. And one could say maybe that ACM has caved in a little bit to the terminology police or policy, if you want to give it a more generous notion. So there is the not current policy on artifact review and badging by the ACM, and there's the current one. And there's an interesting footnote that says something along the lines of, as a result of discussions with the National Information Standards Organization, it was recommended that ACM harmonize its terminology and definitions with those used in the broader scientific research community. And ACM agreed, and so on. Now, one could argue whether that is actually the broader scientific research community, or whether they just agreed with a very visible report coming out of the National Academies group that advocated a particular terminology that is certainly widespread use, but the other use that ACM originally had, we could argue, was also in widespread use. So now, of course, we have created a little bit of a mess. It seems there's now 8 different versions of the guidelines for badging and verification workflows. So when we do computational studies, we might want to provide a means that scientific studies are computationally reproduced. And for that, we might submit our computation artifacts to a journal editor or to specific reproducibility editors that check that what the paper claims and what the code does, that there is a certain level of agreement, right? We need to review papers anyways, the scientific claims, we need to do that too. But at least we can check that the code was submitted, it agrees with what the code, so the results can be reproduced by running the code. Anyway, so we have a little bit of a mess at our hands, and it has actually triggered a lot of papers, I mean, this is just one of them, that try to explain and sort out the terminological mess a little bit. So here's an example from an article by Plesser saying, reproducibility versus replicability, a brief history of a confused terminology. You see the crossing over here, what one calls reproducibility kind of corresponds to what the other one calls replicability, and vice versa. So I would argue that ACM was actually aligned previously, namely with the FASEP, with that large biological community. It just wasn't aligned with the National Academies study. So now it's more aligned, so we could make these lines now parallel, probably, but then we have another community where we still have crossed lines. So it's a little bit of a mess, and of course, as people interested in metadata and information science, we have an answer: just use namespaces. Just be clear about which terminology you adopt. So maybe we shouldn't worry about this too much. I mean, we need to be clear about our terminology and sort things out, but in the end, as long as we define things sort of upfront, I think we can all get along, so to speak. Now, however, sort of a maybe more tricky issue is that often the impression is created that reproducibility is sort of like a staircase. So in the beginning, or at least we have to publish data and make it accessible to all. I think you might see my cursor here on my mouse. And then we share also not just data, but also the code and make it, freely licensed. And then we go a step further, making even the compute environment easily accessible through containers, right? We all have heard about Docker containers. And so it seems that if we just follow that staircase, in the end, we have reusable code and the study is fully reproducible. But then again, we have to be careful with what we mean by reproducible. Maybe we don't have such a staircase. Maybe what we instead have is more a multi-dimensional space where we have to be really careful what it is that we're claiming and what we're asserting with those different words. So one could argue that we have these particular dimensions here, at least. So we have code re-executability. I think there's sometimes a little bit of a bait and switch going on where people treat computational reproducibility synonymous with reproducibility, when really it just means I can get a hold of the code and I can run it and I get the same result that was reported. This is very important. This is not a small feat, but it's just one dimension, right? Again, in the natural sciences, we might have experiment replicability. And again, there's also findings reproducibility. We can vary a lot of things and still get the same result. And that seems to be maybe more evidence for a robust finding than getting exactly the same result on exactly the same setup. That should be unsurprising. Okay. All right. So I think in the interest of time, let me just say one brief thing on this. So if we model reproducibility in this way as a multidimensional notion here, then we could use, find a way out of this terminological quagmire here. So we should recognize that different terminologies not only are used by different communities, and we should, I think, let them use their words. We can't police them too much. And then really recognize that they refer to different dimensions of reproducibility. And of course, again, in the information science business, we have some experience with mapping between different terminologies, and we can use artifacts like crosswalks or more refined versions of the taxonomies and ontologies. That would make sense here. And certainly namespaces are handy here as well. There's also the idea of research objects that gained some momentum in recent years, where you bundle things together, just like you used to have quote unquote only data packages that are bundles of data with metadata that explains everything and makes data more reusable. We can now package also software environments in some sense by reference or directly through build instructions into research objects and make those objects more reliably executable for different people, which would address at least one aspect of this reproducibility business. So the notion here, we could speak of transparent research objects. So again, transparency is in the natural sciences, I already mentioned this a couple of times now, really what makes the science work, but without actually repeating other people's work. Of course, sometimes we will do this, but it's not required, it's not happening all the time. And the question then is, how can these research objects use to extend advantages of transparency to computational research and the computational components of experimental studies? One feature in particular that I think is rather important is the ability to not just have these artifacts, but also work with these artifacts. So with provenance, for example, that can help with transparency, we need to be able not just to have provenance, but to work with it. So for example, to query it, maybe also to visualize it, or combine inquiries and visualization. All right, moving right ahead. So here's some food for thought. Maybe what we should think about is when we look at research objects, of course, as artifacts that perform a specific function, they're guided by an underlying theory, but the objective for those, the goal of these is that they hopefully allow some sort of information gain, which of course in science usually means that we can falsify a particular hypothesis. So, that's sort of certainly one way of looking at science as being different from other endeavors, that you come up with your hypothesis, and then if somebody refutes it, you got to move on to a new and better hypothesis. Of course, there's also confirmatory results, but science by nature is always tentative until more is known. So a model that was developed by a group of people at the Dachschul seminar that I was also involved with is called PriMAD or primed. And I think of it as a work in progress. It just hasn't been picked up. I mean, it has been picked up by scientists, but it hasn't been picked up by the people inventing it, so to say. So I think there's a great opportunity to work on this a little bit more. The idea of the primed model is that to say, if I have a computational study, I should look at what do I keep the same and what do I vary? What is prime? We know this from mathematics. We speak of x and x prime and y prime. And so the question now is, for a computational reproducibility study in particular, are you working on the same platform? That's the P. Are you using the same hardware, or are you using the same container environment or image? Yeah. Or maybe you go one level up in a certain stack of software stack, and you could say, well, do I have the same implementation? Do I have the same code, maybe the same version of the library? Or do I use different libraries, a different implementation language? What about the method and algorithm? Do I use the same way to align my gene sequences to create maybe a phylogenetic tree? Do I use this method or do you use that method? So there is, I think, an intuition that the more you wiggle, the more you vary, the more your x prime is different from your x, maybe the more robust the finding is that you get. This doesn't mean that when you wiggle a little bit here, a little bit there, you don't get a completely different result. You can, but by and large, the information gain seems to be larger if you vary more, and it seems to be overall a little bit less if you vary less. And so that's sort of the idea behind this model. So this is a grossly simplified version here to get this idea across. Let's say if you have an original study where you have some input data X, and you have some parameters P, and some method or algorithm that implements this function F, and then you get an output Y. Now you're trying to reproduce it. So you can wiggle all these things. You could say, okay, I'm not going to use a different data set. I'm going to change my parameters. I'm going to change the implementation language. I'm going to migrate this from Windows to Mac or to Linux. There's all these things that you could change. And I think it seems, at least intuitively, clear that if everything is kept the same, it's great. You're replicating or repeating what somebody else has done. And if you get a successful result, without wiggling, there's not a lot of information gain. You expect this, of course. You say, I run exactly the same thing. Of course, I should get the same result. Now, if you have a failure to reproduce or to replicate, then there's actually a lot of information gain. You thought, okay, I'm doing exactly the same code with the same data on the same machine. I'm just another person. Maybe I did this in the morning, now in the afternoon, I come back after lunch, and it doesn't work anymore. Or you send it to your journal editor, and they try to rerun your result, and everything's supposedly the same, but it doesn't work. So there's a big information gain if you fail to reproduce. But of course, if you're successful, which we all hope, this is to be expected. That's what we're expecting. On the other hand, if you wiggle a lot and you still get the same results, your findings are fairly robust. Yeah, when you fail, in some sense, you're often not necessarily all too surprised because you've changed now so many things. Maybe you're out of scope of what the method is now that was proposed. So anyways, this sort of food for thought, how to think about a different angle of how to look at these reproducibility problems. So this is taken from the report. Again, I view it as work in progress or an initial proposal that could very well be extended further. You see here these primate dimensions here, data, parameters, platform, method implementation, research object, and so on. Research objective and actors, like who's doing it. And depending on what you wiggle or keep the same, you get different use cases. Maybe you could call this a validation. Maybe you could call it a migration to a different platform, okay? So this gives you these ways of sorting things out for these reproducibility studies. Now, I'm not exactly sure how much time I've left, but I hope I still have a couple minutes. to speak about the whole tail project and some things that we do in that project around these notions. So let's first maybe narrow down a particular use case that we could call the journal verification workflow. So whole tail, I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment, is a NSF-funded collaboration to build a platform for quote unquote reproducible science with a suitable definition of reproducible. But this particular use case is fairly narrow, and I think therefore helpful to focus on. It's also a new use case in that we didn't originally have that on our radar when we started whole tail a number of years ago. So there has been a study by Craig Willis, and below you see the reference to his PhD thesis, Trust But Verify, an investigation of methods of verification and dissemination of computational research artifacts for transparency and reproducibility. Very wisely, he used both the T word and the R word in his title. So some of the findings from his research were that many initiatives have common basic requirements for transparency and computational reproducibility. The initiatives rely on established research repositories. So we have these repositories that are out there, so the artifacts can be preserved also for long-term access. So in the whole tail project, we also provide access to these repositories. On the other hand, there is an editorial infrastructure lacking that would make it easy for those data and editors and reproducibility editors, if we call this new profession, to support this. Now, to some extent, whole tail provides this, but more is needed. So maybe we can work on follow-up initiatives to target this use case more specifically. And of course, we also need standards. Can't really do without them completely. So we need a standard for how to describe and package these research objects that are both, reproducible in the sense that we can rerun code, but they're also transparent in that they reveal what happened when the code was run, just in case we can't run it, or more importantly, to reveal things that the re-execution does not reveal. Transparency and re-execution are sort of orthogonal in many ways. Alrighty, so what's basically the overall workflow when we work with whole tail? So we think of it as a reproducible computational research platform. Scientists develop their computational scripts and workflows using tools they already know. I think most of us are done with the idea of forcing any particular system down their throats. They say, look, I use Python, I use R, can I please keep using that? So we need to instrument these environments sometimes in ways to make things easier to be monitored, say, for provenance capture. Of course, scientists develop, again, those scripts, then they do the data analysis, then they share their findings through papers and repositories and so on. Of course, we want to have some sort of transparent mechanism to go back to these artifacts and work with them. So things need to be packaged up. And then, of course, again, a reproducibility editor, for example, or just a colleague, a peer, might want to also work with the artifacts themselves. So what's inside of a tail, again, somewhat simplifying, we can say data goes in there, or either directly or by reference. Then code goes in there, software goes in there. And then in some sense, the compute environment goes in there as well. So using Docker containers in particular, we can create or recreate the same environment that was used when the scientists created the experiment and study in the first place. And then we share those through public repositories, for example, Dataverse or Zenodo, or Data One, which itself is sort of a federation of other repositories. Okay, so there are a couple of new features that I'm only going to tease you with very briefly. These are still in development, but should be coming out in the next release of whole tail within a few months, if not sooner. So we have this feature that we call a recorded run to support transparency. So the idea is that as you execute a workflow and you switch on sort of the recorded run toggle, certain provenance artifacts, certain data lineage artifacts are captured, and that you can then put them in your tail, which is our name for a research object. And so here's an example of what we're currently planning to do. We try to use other tools that already exist. So there's a tool called Reproducibility that's out there, created in the community that we could adopt, or we use the underlying technology. We're still figuring this out. We could put things in a little database, use other tools, and then expose it, for example, as RDF metadata or data. And then, again, in our case, we think that abilities to query that data is very important. It's one thing to collect provenance, but then you need to use it, make it accessible, queryable as well. Otherwise, what's the point? All right. Then there's a particular provenance model that we're developing that should encompass what we call prospective and retrospective provenance. That's a whole separate talk, and I can only scratch the surface of that in my next few slides. And then once we have a recorded run, then we can ask questions. Again, I think that's an important feature. So we can ask, show me all the inputs and outputs of a given run of the computational experiment. What software was installed? What versions were installed? All of these things, we should be able to answer those questions and generate those reports for researchers. So very briefly, what do I mean by retrospective and prospective provenance? I only keep this, again, in the quick flyby mode here. When researchers create their workflows, they often use scripts, Python and R, for example. And we want to expose the method behind the script. One way to do that is using a tool that we've developed called Yes Workflow. And the idea is that the author of a script kind of declares in a fairly simple and high-level language how he or she thinks about the script as if it were a workflow. So we see green boxes, which correspond to steps. We see yellow nodes that correspond to data that flows between the steps. So essentially, the Yes Workflow model is a data flow model that gives an overview of what the script is doing as if it was developed by a workflow system. Now, this is prospective provenance because it's a workflow. It's something that you can do over and over again. In that sense, it's prospective. There are other tools that capture retrospective provenance, which is often more fine-grained. This is recording what actually happened at the level of particular files that are accessed and all of that. And in our own studies, we found that when we combine them together in an artifact that we call hybrid provenance, so both the recorded, automatically recorded retrospective provenance and the sort of user-declared conceptual prospective provenance, if we have ways to integrate that information, we can have the best of both worlds. We can get the conceptual overview, what the scientist was sort of thinking when they put together the computational workflow, as well as what actually happened. So I think there's a great market for that. All right, takeaway points. I'm done, I'm wrapping up here. Computational reproducibility often doesn't mean what you think it might mean. I think it's sometimes misunderstood as scientific reproducibility, when it's really more the notion of I can re-execute somebody else's code, which is very valuable, but it's only part of the game. In particular, computational reproducibility is in general not required for science. I mean, depending on what science you're doing, it's certainly very helpful. Transparency, on the other hand, seems to be required for science. If you're not transparent, what are you doing? You're a magician, maybe. So both have their place, I think, in data and compute-intensive scientific publishing. So overall, my goal with this presentation today is pointing out some of the challenges there, and maybe also shifting a little bit our attention from R words to T words. And with this, I'd like to all invite you to participate by either attending or actively participating in the workshop that's coming up in July. And I provide the URL for that as well. There is a community event called Provenance Week 2021 in July. And as part of that, we're organizing, some of us are organizing a workshop exactly around this notion of maybe shifting attention from R words to T words, not by replacing them, but just giving them some attention that they deserve. So here are some of the T words. Of course, transparency, I talked about. Trustworthiness is, do we have true records of the methods and processes yielding a research artifact? Do we have a traceable lineage of the individual data products, and so on? So it's easy to participate. You can either just show up, or even better, you write a one-page position statement and say what you want to say, and we'll try to have a very lively discussion. So this is not your usual, here's a presentation, everybody go home. we want to make this really interactive. All right, and I think that was my last slide, and I ran through them rather quickly, and hope there's a little time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertram, for your presentation. It's very impressive. So let's move to the Q&A session. I think we will only leave right now 5 minutes of Q&A session. Yeah, for in terms of the time. So anyone who has questions could post that in the Q&A session, or you could, I think, raise your hand for any questions you have for Bertram.
Thanks for sharing that link. I see somebody found it already. The power of search engines. Okay, so that is exactly the workshop. That's exactly the link that I see in the chat there. So yeah, so I covered maybe a lot of ground and somewhat quickly. I guess there's an opportunity to watch it in slow motion since it's being recorded. So one particular thing that I mentioned in the abstract that I didn't get a chance to talk to, but I can mention, we're trying to apply these techniques also to data curation, data cleaning workflows. In particular, some of you actually know this quite well. We've worked with biodiversity, informatics people, natural history museum folks to help them clean their data that comes from different sources and therefore has different data quality issues. One really down-to-earth tool that we're also trying to enhance with our work is OpenRefine. So many of you might have used it already, or at least heard about it. It's a tool that lets you load a data set. It looks a little bit like a spreadsheet interface, but then it has sort of data cleaning operations, trimming white spaces, clustering columns, and maybe unifying terminology, making things canonical. So really an important step before you do data analysis is this data cleaning. And when you now have a new data cleaned product, you might say, well, how do I know that what I got is better than what I had before? Again, transparency can be your friend. You might want to be able to see what changes were done, particularly if your cleaned product somehow gives you the wrong results. You might have overdone the cleaning. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to sink our teeth and brains into it.
I have one question maybe, and we have just maybe 1 or 2 minutes because we need to continue with the webinar. But okay, so this was very interesting, and I really can relate to this talk very well because I also participated in a conversation where we were really discussing so actively about what does it mean to be transparent and where the openness comes in, and then also it is like different levels of kind of like where does reproducibility go? What should be kind of like considered to be the top? And so my question to you is like, for example, when we discuss whole tail, what definitions of reproducibility would you use? Because you introduced like so many, but then
I added more to the mess, maybe. So there is actually also a paper associated with this, or actually two, the primate paper and another one that I need to share the references with you all. So I would say that the kind of computational reproducibility, the first thing that we want to do with whole tail is making it really easy to re-execute your code. So get a hold of the data, get a hold of the code, and then being able to make it really easy for somebody else to get the same result. This relates a little bit also to Lisa's question that I've seen in the chat. She asked the role of reproducibility editors. How does that relate to the professionalization of data curators' role, and are they the same? I think there's certainly an opportunity, in addition to doing data curation functions, to also do, shall we say, code curation and re-execution functionality. I think that's certainly an opportunity for maybe further development into that direction. There's one person that we've interacted with and that we hope will attend and actively participate in this workshop that I mentioned is Lars Wilhuber, who is a data editor for, I think, what is it, the American Journal for some economics journal, where he basically has this role of a reproducibility editor. So again, I'm happy to share the information that I have on him. But so to wrap up your question, Anna, so there is on the one hand, there is the need to really be able to re-execute the code. There's no question, that's very convenient. Everybody does it now with containers and Wholetail and Binder and CodeOcean and so on. On the other hand, we are adding provenance capture capabilities that address this transparency issue. So because again, if you just have in some sense a black box or something that you don't dare open because it's sort of the Pandora's box, and you just get the same result, your information gain is limited. You often want to be able, both as the creator of a study as well as the user of a study, to see what really went into it, which data sets were actually used for this run. Oh, you have created 10 runs, 5 of them use this data set, 3 use that data set, and the other, we don't even know what data set was used. So if you can generate such reports, I think there's a great opportunity to make studies also more transparent, not just executable. I hope that answers somewhat.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and it's really interesting. I will definitely follow up to see about this workshop where you talk more about the T-words. That's I think very relevant.
Also around throughout the day, and then also for the cocktail hour or whatever it's called.
So fantastic.
We can chat about this some more if people have further questions. Thank you.